So we've been talking in class a lot about grief, and it's a really tough topic because we are so uncomfortable with some of these emotions that are connected with grief. And after the grief lecture, we talked about all these different stages of grief and how they don't go in a particular order and how it can be really difficult. I shared a lot of my own examples of grief that I've gone through, and some of my students had some questions about how can they help their friends that are dealing with grief, and what should they do if they're feeling stuck in depression. And I think this is such an important topic that I took my students' questions and I'm asking some mental health professionals to walk us through some of these more difficult questions. And so we have two counselors. We have Mrs. Bagnara and Mrs. Burns, and they're going to introduce themselves to us.
Well, I'm a clinical professional counselor, so I work with individuals, sometimes families as well, doing counseling. And grief is something that we definitely come across. So I got my bachelor's degree in psychology from Concordia University Irvine and my master's degree in counseling psychology from Towson University in Maryland.
Well, I hold a bachelor's degree in psychology. I hold a master's degree in school counseling, and I am currently working on a second master's degree in clinical mental health.
The students had a lot of questions after our lesson about specific things about grief. When you're talking to people about grief, what are some things that people tend to get wrong about it?
I think because it's just uncomfortable, they just don't want to go through it. They think there's some way they can bypass it. And so I just encourage people, that they can handle the uncomfortable experience of grief, and that they can find ways to grieve effectively, because sometimes that sounds scary and overwhelming. And so just encouraging them that this is a normal process, and they can find ways to go through this.
When we're talking about the stages of grief, so many of the students want to know, how can we speed up the process? Even after on their test it says there is no specific time, but they kind of wanted to know, can you speed it up? Or how does that work?
Well, the stages of grief are interesting because they don't go in order, and they're not really stages. They're just kind of common feelings that people experience during the grief process. And so it almost is hurtful that it has been taught as a stage, because students believe if I move through this feeling and onto what I believe is the next stage, but then this other feeling comes back, it means that I'm not making progress. When the reality is it's going to be all over the place, because that's what grief is. I always look at it like when you see people who've gone through an extreme weight loss journey. If I have lost 200 pounds and I gain back 10, yes, I gained 10 pounds, but that doesn't take away from the fact that I lost 200. And grief is the same way. We make progress. Sometimes it's a little faster than others, but there's really never a point that's backwards movement.
Unfortunately, there isn't. Although I will say that there are definitely ways where you can make it longer and more painful for yourself. So there are things to avoid, right, that will make it more of a smoother process, so to say.
What would those things be to avoid a longer grief?
Well, I would say going in one of either two extremes. So sometimes people just stay stuck and sort of wallow in what they're feeling, and it really disconnects them from their day-to-day life. They might, neglect to care for themselves or neglect their responsibilities, isolate themselves, and that's not really going to be helpful for them to go that far to the extreme, right? But then some people go the opposite extreme too, where they bury themselves in their responsibilities. They avoid how they're feeling. So I always encourage people to find a balance where you're allowing yourself to feel what you're feeling. You're accepting whatever stage you're in, because you're right, there isn't a way to control what's coming up for you, whether it's depression or anger or bargaining. But also to find ways to still have a routine, still have some productivity and normalcy in your life, because it's going to help you for the grief to feel less painful as time goes on, if you can find a little bit of a balance.
Is it wrong to call them stages of grief? Is there a better term?
No, I think that I like to lean a little bit more toward emotions of grief, or even maybe phases. But even phases isn't much better. Stages is fine as long as we're really careful in articulating that this isn't going to be an even progression, and it's going to skip around, and you're going to jump backwards and forwards.
Okay. So in class, we talked about the stages of grief and how we have all of these different emotions connected with it. There's anger, there's denial, and there's depression. And we tried really hard in class to make the distinction between a depression that's a clinical depression, where someone might have a chemical imbalance or a long-going issue, versus a depression that's connected to a grief experience. But a question that my students have is, how do you know if you have a grief kind of response to a particular experience that's a depression for a short time versus a depression that turns into a clinical depression? How do you know the difference?
Well, it's there. I kind of have like a two-part answer to that. First, we want to look at like what differentiates this the very normal grieving process of depression. That's not a disorder. That's not like a abnormal part of the human experience, and clinical depression, right? So with clinical depression, it's more than just a feeling of sadness and lack of motivation. With clinical depression, you also have a lot of feelings of unworthiness, lack of self-esteem, and those aren't things you would necessarily see if you're grieving the loss of someone. So that's what really makes it distinct. What I will say is, if you go in one of those extremes, right, where you're completely avoiding your grief, or you're just sitting in it and neglecting the rest of your life, you kind of put yourself at risk for what's called complicated grief. And complicated grief is where you're not experiencing any alleviation in that grieving process or in the pain you're feeling after about 4 or 5 months after the loss. Now, this may be because of traumatic circumstances related to the grief, so that may make sense. But of course, one of those extremes reactions is also going to set you up for that, right? So with complicated grief, you are more at risk for developing a mental health disorder, whether it's depression or anxiety or PTSD, because you're kind of putting your mental health at risk from that.
Well, I think untreated and unsupported and with other environmental factors, it could. It's not necessarily going to happen. Clinical depression is usually characterized by kind of a long period of not only feeling bad and not knowing why, which is what makes it different from grief, but then also kind of these other losses, a loss of interest, a loss of being able to find joy, a loss of being able to find connection. And that's not something that you typically see long term with grief depression.
In class, we study a lot about Job and how he gets really angry. And I know that a lot of my students, they're very worried about their friends who are going through grief, or maybe a family member, and they want to say something to fix it, but they also know there's nothing we can say to fix it. How do we help the students if they have a friend or family member going through grief? What are some things they can do to help in that experience?
Well, the book of Job teaches us exactly how to be there for people with grief. When you look at Job's 3 friends, before they messed up and before they got it wrong and they said all the wrong things, what they did was what we are to do. They showed up and they sat. And they just were there. And so there's even a Jewish tradition of when you go to be with someone who's grieving, no one speaks until the grieving person speaks, which I think is really beautiful, because where we become harmful is when we start to kind of fumble around and try to find a silver lining or say things that are meant to be comforting but can sound kind of insulting. And I think the biggest thing is we have to run toward people that are grieving. We can't be afraid because we're awkward. And just being there, and the statement of, I love you and my heart is hurting for you, is really all you need to say. The other thing that we tend to do is put responsibility onto the grieving person for ways that we can help them feel better. And it's really kind of an unfair exchange, because I'm already sad and now I have to come up with something that's going to make you feel better because you feel like you're helping me. And so I always encourage people to reach out and be concrete. Can I drop off dinner on Sunday or Monday? Do you need help picking up the kids this weekend or next weekend? Are there groceries that you can send me in a list, because I'm going to the store to get things for you? And just what we can do to kind of take away some of the decision fatigue that comes with going through grief, and then also just be intentional in how we're supporting them.
So you mentioned groceries and pickup. What might be some 14-year-old versions of that because they want to help their friends. What are some things that they could say, I would like to do X, Y, Z?
Well, can we study together? Can I go over my notes with you? Because I'm sure it was probably really hard for you to focus and to get through that class. Can I pick you up for the basketball game? Let's go get boba. Just a concrete plan that we can follow through on.
I would say just to focus on being the best support person that you can. Make sure to spend time with them. Make sure to check in with how they're doing so that they're not isolating themselves. I would say, make sure they are finding that balance of experiencing, expressing their grief, but also keeping up with their day-to-day responsibilities. Not to say that you need to, if you're in a period of grief, do everything you normally do. There may be things that make sense to take a step back from. So I would say just being a support person and walking alongside is the biggest thing because, there isn't anything that's going to just magically fix it, right? But to know that you're not alone in it is the most helpful thing.
So when we're talking about adversity, and we had a group discussion a couple years ago, and they talked about what are the negative effects of adversity. So many of my students said that anger is a negative part of adversity. And I think that's a little troubling because anger is part of the grief experience. Can you help us kind of think about anger as an emotion and how we deal with this?
Well, first of all, as humans, the human experience is we feel how we feel. And the last thing we need is shame or guilt for having a feeling. And so I think that we have to really look out for each other that way, that if you feel angry, you feel angry. I don't get to tell you you don't feel angry. I don't get to tell you that you shouldn't feel angry, that you feel how you feel. Anger is what we kind of refer to as a secondary emotion. Rarely is anger actually the full emotion by itself. Usually lurking under the surface of it is sadness, is disappointment, is regret, or all of those feelings. Death is really unfair for the living. It's really unfair when we have to say goodbye to someone and then be in the waiting until we can see them again. And so unfair things do spark anger. And so I think that when we can say, this is how I feel and it's fine, and acknowledge it and name it, and then kind of sit for a little bit and explore what other feelings are tagging along with it though, because usually those are the feelings that we need to address.
Well, we got to really pull back the layers of that, right? Because anger is unpleasant to experience. Anger is not fun. But it has a place in the normal range of human emotions. It's not something that is counterproductive for us to feel. When we're angry, it's because something wrong has happened. And of course, in the discussion of grief, and of course, discussing grief in the context of faith, we weren't meant originally to die and to experience loss. So yes, there is something wrong here. There is something wrong with grief because we shouldn't be feeling it if we were back in Eden. Does that make sense? Mm-hmm. And so
the anger is connected to sin, which I think is also a godly type of a thing because God does not love sin.
Right.
It makes him angry too.
Right. And I think an important thing to remember is that God grieves with us when we lose someone. He doesn't want us to be experiencing this. I mean, think about Jesus. He grieved, he cried over losing his friend Lazarus, right? So he knows this experience intimately. And I think he knows that this experience involves anger. And sometimes the reason that we think of anger as a negative is because we think of, is it a sin for me to be angry at God? But really, God can handle it. God can handle whatever you're feeling. He doesn't judge you for it because he knows it intimately. And so I just want to encourage people to accept their anger, right? Not to stay and wallow in it, right? Like we had said earlier, but to accept that it makes sense in this context. It makes sense because something's wrong here. This isn't the way it should be. And to feel free to express that to God because he knows, he gets it, and he can help.
We talk in class about like the stigma of getting mental health. I feel like there's been a shift, that the parents maybe feel a little more uncomfortable talking about these things than the students.
Mhm.
Do you see that in like the culture of mental health, that it's becoming less stigmatized?
Definitely. There's been some research showing like which generations are most likely to go to mental health treatment, and Gen Z is really the ones that are saying like, yeah, we got to do this, right? We got to prioritize our mental health, and they're not afraid to go.
And that's really good.
Mhm.
I'm really think that's a really good thing for them.
Mhm.
My students are very interested in caring for their mental health. And we also talked about how trauma is something where you need to seek professional help. What recommendations can you have for students if they feel like they are dealing with something that they need extra help with? What advice would you give to a student who's struggling with something like a mental disorder?
Well, there's definitely help out there. It's not something that you are just broken or stuck in, right? So I would say find a mental health professional. Maybe that's a counselor, therapist, social worker. Since these are students, right, they can definitely get connected through their school counselor and find referrals to professionals out in the community. Find someone that you trust and you have a good working relationship with so that they can help you in this healing process.
I don't know if grief is something that you're struggling with right now, or maybe you have a loved one who's going through grief. But I think it's really important for us to remember how that we can support each other in this time, and to know the peace that we have in Christ. That no one knows our grief more than Jesus, and that He is with us. And if you are feeling alone, please reach out. Please connect to someone at school, someone at church, but don't do this alone. And if you don't have anyone, I'd really recommend this resource that helped me when I was in a season of grief. It's called Grief Share, and they have opportunities all throughout the country of meeting with other people and kind of doing like a group kind of biblical centered grief therapy. It's very useful for someone who is struggling, but make sure that you reach out and know that you are not alone, and that Jesus, He mourns with us and He loves us even in our grief.